Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the final and fourth installment of the ACT series. Today, we'll be talking about applying ACT English skills to your instruction through your high-quality instructional materials. In the last session, we went over the basics of the ACT English test. In the previous two, we focused on the reading test. This will be the last one of the entire series, and we'll be focusing in on how to apply everything that we learned in the last session to the English test. So our main objectives today are to draw some correlations between the ACT English test and the reading and writing ropes, which we talked about last time, identify specific high-value skills in the English ACT subtest that you can also find in your HQIM and in your curriculums, and then connect the skills of the ACT English test to what you're already doing in your classroom so that we're not, reinventing the wheel and making new things when we don't necessarily have to. We're going to quickly review. I've shown this now. This is the fourth time you should be seeing this. But this is, again, some research that just kind of shows how the ACT subtests correlate to, or the scores on them correlate to success or predicted college readiness in these specific college courses. So as always, feel free to take a moment to pause and look at this, but we're looking at English today. So we're looking at trying to get that benchmark score of at least an 18. And remember, if you've got kids who want to take dual enrollment English 101 at your school, they need to have this benchmark as well, because this is one of the subtests that colleges will look at in isolation, in addition to math. And then just another piece of information or a little chart infographic to put into perspective that the reason why this is such a big push for colleges is that it's supposed to determine if these students are ready for college. And we find that there is some data to support that the more benchmarks a student is met on the test, the more likely they are to finish their degree program. Again, I said this every other time. Doesn't mean that just because a kid is not at all the benchmarks that they can't finish their degree programs. It's just that there's more likelihood that they will. They're more college ready when they step onto that campus as a freshman when they have these benchmarks under control. And then I showed this last time as well, I believe, but if not, this is the key for the English test and the score chart. Remember, the score chart varies slightly from test to test. I do like students to be aware that they do not have to get every single question right, or even sometimes more than half of the questions right to reach benchmark. Now, obviously we want them shooting for higher than that, but for our students who are not at benchmark yet, this can be really anxiety settling for them, because they realize, oh, I don't have to be close to perfect to do okay on this test. I just have to get to 37 questions or 40 questions and do really well on those 40, and I had my benchmark. So just kind of setting them up with some like milestones along the way after they hit that benchmark, then you can set them for the next level of where they want to go on their scores. I also want to bring us back to the two ropes that we looked at last time. We looked at the reading rope in all three of the previous sessions. I introduced to you guys the writing rope at the last session. Both of these ropes indicate individual skills that make up a good reader and what makes up a good writer. The skills on both of those ropes are also skills that students are going to need to be proficient on the ACT English and ACT reading tests. There are a lot of overlapping similarities between the two ropes. If you look at them, you can see that they use some of the same language, but you can take a moment to pause the screen and look at it again a little bit more closely, but we'll be focusing a lot on the writing rope today, and also just how those skills also translate into the reading rope for your students. Okay, so one more thing to review before we move on is just some of the basics of this test. There are 3 reporting categories for the question types on this test. That's CSE, which is Conventions of Standard English, which is most of the test. It's 40 questions, sometimes a little bit more, and there's only 75 questions on the test, so it's more than half the test. Production of writing, which is roughly 20 questions, and then KLA, which is knowledge and language, which is somewhere around 10 to 12 questions. CSE, like I said, is the largest category. It's going to be questions about punctuation and grammar. Students who can do really well on those questions do have a bit of a leg up if they already have really good grammar skills. But that's why it's so important that we continue to teach those foundational grammar skills even once they get to our high school classrooms. So we'll talk about what parts of grammar are more heavily tested than others. You also want to look at skills that make people proficient writers outside of grammar, like things like writing concisely and developing strong claims, because that's going to help them with their production of writing questions and with their KLA questions. So we'll talk about how you can incorporate some explicit and direct instruction on some of these topics. and apply it to their writing as well, because that's where you're really going to see kids grow, is where they can apply these skills. And that also means it can translate to the test as well. Okay, so let's look a little bit more closely at the grammar and punctuation skills for the ACT. I'm going to go through these skills, and then I'm going to show some examples of test questions. And I have a couple of resources as well for where you can go to learn some more about that topic, or you can use it to show students more about that topic. And then we'll talk about implications of these skills on the ACT in your own classroom. So let's talk about what is the most common punctuation that is tested on the ACT. Commas. Commas are all over this test. It is a very heavily tested skill, and it's not just one way that we use commas. It's in many different ways that commas are used. So these next few slides are going to highlight not just commas, all the other grammar and punctuation skills that are going to be tested, but you will see a good bit about commas on here. It's not an all-inclusive list of every grammar concept that there is. It's just the ones that are necessary to see some success on this test. So of course, if you have the time and the means to teach other grammar skills, go for it. But this is going to focus on just what they need to be just baseline proficient writers and do okay on the ACT. Leaving students feedback, really targeted and concise feedback in their writing on these topics, is also going to go a long way for your students as well. They need to see where they may have made a mistake and how they can fix it as well. So most often the commas are going to be tested in one of the three ways that you see on the screen. So when creating a compound sentence, which means that you're joining two independent clauses together to make one sentence, you're going to need a comma, and it must be followed by a coordinating conjunction. I usually use the acronym FANBOYS when I'm working with students on the ACT, because a lot of them have heard FANBOYS as children. It stands for for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. Those are all of our coordinating conjunctions that we can use to join two independent clauses together. Now, you're going to have to also make sure that students know what an independent clause is, and that an independent clause is a sentence that can stand on its own as a subject and a verb, and it expresses a complete thought. It's a complete sentence. So when you're trying to combine two complete sentences together, you can't just stick them together with no punctuation. That's a run-on sentence. It's a fused sentence. And then you can't just stick them together and put a comma in between the two, because then you have a comma splice. So they have to know that when I have two independent clauses that I want to make into one sentence, I must have a comma, and I must have one of those fanboy words with it. They don't necessarily need to be able to say on the test, this is an independent clause, but in terms of being able to apply where the comma goes, knowing what different clauses are is going to be essential for them to be able to do well. But in your writing feedback, you might find yourself using run-on or comma splice or things like that. This is a very pointed, isolated little skill you can teach them that is going to help them on the test, that is also going to improve their writing as well. You're also going to see when you're punctuating a non-essential clause, which just means what it sounds like. It just means that there's information in that sentence that is inserted after a noun in the sentence that gives more detail or context about that noun. But if it were to be removed from the sentence maintains its integrity, its meaning, its structure. It doesn't really take anything away from the meaning of the sentence to remove it. So that means we put commas around it to punctuate that is extra information that could be removed from the sentence. Making sure students understand that if removing that information compromises the meaning of the sentence, then it is considered essential, and it does not need a comma or need commas around it. So if you look at the example sentence, the teacher who was never late before came into class 15 minutes after it started. That who was never late before doesn't really change the meaning of the sentence that the teacher was late to class. So you could take that information out, which means we're going to put commas around it to separate it from the rest of the sentence to indicate to the reader that it is a non-essential clause. So this is just examples of how students understanding punctuation impacts the meaning of a sentence, and how syntax impacts the meaning of a sentence, which kind of relates back to the writing rope and the reading rope as well. And then lastly, the last way I'm going to talk about with commas is joining dependent and independent clauses together. So writing a complex sentence or a compound complex sentence. This is again where they need to know how to identify dependent versus independent clauses. The dependent independent clause can be joined in any order. So in the example sentence, throughout the course of a year, students will learn many new skills. That one is the dependent clause is first. It's an introductory phrase, which is very often how students will see it, but you could have sentences where the independent clause is first and the dependent clause is after, as well as if you have compound complex sentences. But, start small with them and start with just the complex sentence, and start with the easiest way to teach it, which to me seems like where you have the dependent clause first, followed by the independent clause, and then go into some more complicated ones after they've really grasped that one. But those 3 comma skills will show up multiple times on any ACT that your kids take. Some other common punctuation that will appear, semicolons are on the test a good bit. Students think that these are some like big, bad, weird piece of punctuation they don't know how to use, but if they know how to use a period, then they do know how to use a semicolon. They just need to know that the semicolon needs to go in between 2 independent clauses or 2 complete sentences that are kind of related to each other. And they need to know that capitalization is not needed after the semicolon unless it is a proper noun. So the book was a classic. That's a complete sentence. It was meant to be read through the ages. Another complete sentence that is further describing the book that we were talking about in the first independent clause. So I can put a semicolon there and make it, and it would be correct. Obviously, you can put a period there and capitalize it, but this makes it a little bit more varied in sentence structure. So if students ask, why can't I just put a period? You can talk about how varying sentence structure in writing is essential to engaging your readers and keeping your readers from kind of getting bored with like repetitive, choppy sentences. Colons will also appear on the test. They require a complete sentence before the punctuation, and then whatever comes after the punctuation really doesn't matter. It can be a single word, it can be another complete sentence, so it could be a list, it could be a phrase. I mean, it doesn't matter as long as whatever comes before that colon is a complete sentence. So for example, the best king cake is made by my favorite bakery. That's a complete sentence on its own, but I want to tell you who it is, so I'm announcing it's Antoine's. And then we will see dashes and we will see apostrophes on the ACT as well. Dashes are kind of interchangeable with 2 other skills that we've already reviewed. So if your students can handle it, maybe even consider teaching this like concurrently. The single dash is interchangeable with the colon. So the same rules that we just talked about apply. I even use the exact same example sentence where you just have to have a complete sentence before. And then the double dashes are also interchangeable with the double commas for non-essential clauses. Again, same rules apply. I use the same example sentence. And then lastly, apostrophes. We all know that they're used for contractions. That's probably not going to be what they're tested on so much as possession. Students really get tripped up with this a lot because it's such an easy thing to overlook. But you need to know that when you are showing possession of something that is singular, then you use apostrophe S. And if it's something that is plural, where adding the S to the word makes it plural, then it's S apostrophe. So like, for example, the plural of child is children. So if you were saying children's books, then you would just put the apostrophe S. But if it's a word like dogs, you have to add an S to the word dog to make it plural. So the apostrophe goes after the S. And they also need to be aware of the one exception, which I guarantee you will be on this test multiple times probably, is ITS versus IT apostrophe S. This is the exception with contractions and possession. So IT apostrophe S is the contraction for it is, and then ITS, no apostrophe at all, is the plural singular possessive form of the word it. That is something they need to know because it will be on the test. They love to put it on this test. Speaking of singular versus plural, that is going to be another kind of heavily tested skill that they know how to write correctly when we're using singular versus plural. So moving out of punctuation into some more of the grammar on the test, they're going to be looking at subject verb agreement questions. Students are going to need to make sure that they can identify the subject of a sentence and whether or not it's singular or plural in order to select the correct verb for the sentence. So for example, in the sentence, we are going to the mall after school, the subject we is plural, which indicates the use of the word are for our verb rather than is. And you're going to have lots of other variations of this. If students struggle to identify the subject of the sentence, sometimes you can tell them, okay, well, let's find the verb. And then you can tell me in this sentence who or what is performing this verb or is doing the verb. And that's typically where you can find your subject as well. But working on just that basic skill of identifying subjects and verbs and then identifying if the subject is singular or plural is going to go a long way for the kids who are struggling with this. And again, you're probably marking this in your students' writing. You're probably seeing errors in subject verb agreement. It's a really common error that kids make. So this is, again, not something that you're just prepping them for the ACT. They're also learning to write correctly through this instruction. And then lastly, you will see some pronoun agreement questions as well. To do these questions, they have to know what nouns and pronouns are. So usually I can tell you what a noun is. I do find that kids sometimes struggle with telling me what a pronoun's purpose is. They can tell me examples of a pronoun, like he, she, they, it, but they don't always know what their function is. So they need to be aware that a pronoun is a word that is used to replace a noun in a sentence. So they're going to have to locate whatever noun the pronoun in the sentence is referring to, determine if that noun is singular or plural, and then from there, select the appropriate pronoun to match. So for example, Sally was always on time for school. So when she was late today, I was worried. Sally is my noun that the word she in the second part of the sentence is referring to. So I need to make sure that, because I know Sally is a girl and it's a singular person, that I'm using a singular feminine pronoun to refer to Sally. Once you go over this a few times and you start to talk about, like, oh, it's replacing the word for that we use to identify this person, it's replacing the word we use to identify this object, kids can start to pick up on it. But I do suggest having some kind of anchor chart with first, second, and third person pronouns, as well as their singular and their plural versions. That way when kids are writing, they can refer to that as well. It's been super helpful in my own instruction for kids to be able to refer back to that, because just like as a side note, kids love to write in first person, even when you tell them not to. And we have some kids that really like to use second person, but generally once they get to their upper level English classes, we want them writing in third. So they struggle to like make that switch. To just have that visual there for them is going to go a long way. All right, so let's look at a couple example questions of CSE that are on the test. This graphic should look familiar, but I've kind of labeled some of the CSE questions that are on the test as like what types of questions they are. Commonly confused words, I see then versus than very, very often, pretty much every test that I've looked at in the last couple of years. Affect versus effect is on there a lot. I also have seen sight versus sight a few times. So those are just some ones to kind of keep in mind. And then we've talked about it's versus it's already, but that one like is almost a surefire bet that it's going to be on the test. We just talked about subject verb agreement, where we teach them to find the subject, identify if it's singular or plural, and then pick the appropriate noun. As far as commas go, students, they need to be able to identify that clause type to be able to do the comma questions correctly. And they need to also be able to identify what is essential versus non-essential in a sentence. So that may take some practice, that may take some feedback on their writing and making them go and fix that a few times, but it's got to be some deliberate instruction that they have lots and lots of repeated practice with, so that they can kind of get that ingrained into their own writing as well. And then when they see it on the ACT, they're going to know if it's done correctly or not, and they'll know how to pick the correct answer. Number 39 is a noun pronoun question. If you look, all of those answer choices are pronouns. So that's how you should teach your students to know, like, oh, this is a pronoun noun question. I need to go find the noun and figure out which pronoun is appropriate, which I just want to backtrack 1 second. Same thing for subject verb agreement questions. If you look at the subject verb agreement questions, they all the answer choices are verbs. That is how you know you're on a subject verb agreement question. So that's another way that, like, a tip you can give kids, that like, oh, I need to go and find the subject of this sentence because all these answer choices are verbs. I'm doing a subject verb agreement question. So just like that's a little test taking tips there. And then if you look at the bottom graphic on here, 34, 35, and 36, those are all CSE questions as well. You've got a possession / apostrophe question with the colonists. You've got a verb question, and you've got semicolons and commas and like which ones to use and where. So again, like I showed you earlier, or like I told you earlier, they're not going to ever say which one of these is the verb, or which one of these is the noun, or which one of these is the dependent clause. They're going to have to know that to be able to apply where the punctuation goes. Okay, so let's talk about how that fits into your curriculum, into your HQIM. All that punctuation that we've talked about, all that grammar that we've talked about, it is supposed to be in good writing. So your students need to know how to use it in their own writing. The reading and the writing rope strands about syntax are really well represented in this category. So students should understand that punctuation is essential to making meaning from sentences, and to making sure that if they're communicating to others through writing, that they're getting their message across effectively as well. Direct and explicit instruction for all of these skills is important. You have to do that first. Then once you've done that really good direct and explicit instruction, start using things like mentor sentences to model good writing. Most of the curriculums that we use have these already selected that you can use to model the skill. But if you notice that you're teaching a skill that the selected mentor sentence doesn't necessarily cover, you can find one or write one that you can use for your students. I would not overwhelm them with how much punctuation you're throwing at them, because this can be a very dry subject. I would focus on 1 to 2 punctuation skills at a time, and then expect them, once they've kind of shown proficiency in those skills, that like, okay, the expectation is that you always use this in your writing as we move on and build up on more and more skills that I'm going to teach you in your writing. And then having students revise their writing to incorporate the specific punctuation or grammar skill is very powerful. You want to avoid that drill and kill and make this useful to them. So show them in their own writing. Have student writing up on the board that you can use as exemplars and non-exemplars, and have students work together as a class to fix it. Have them do it in their own individual writing from the feedback that you give them. So that way you're not creating new assignments and new quizzes and you're just taking the stuff that you're already going to be doing in class, and you're really fine-tuning where you're targeting that information and that instruction for the kids. So we talked about mentor sentences for a minute. These are great to use for CSE questions. You can use them for lots of other things, but for ACT purposes and all of the HQIM, mentor sentences are really powerful. So if you look in this one sentence alone, I already see a couple opportunities to look at apostrophes, to look at dashes, to look at commas. So you've got a lot going on in this sentence, and it may be that you only want to focus on the dash, or you only want to focus on the commas. You may not want to do all of those things in this one sentence, because it's really going to be dependent on where your kids are. But there's definitely some opportunities to talk about punctuation and grammar and how that impacts the meaning of the sentence in this one sentence. You can get a lot out of it, and it comes directly from the complex text you're going to be reading in class. So you're again not creating anything new. You're just taking the time that you're already using for instruction, and you're just adding in this component. Or not even adding, you're just focusing in a little more closely on this component. So this is important to keep in mind when you're planning that, where can I just take the things that I'm already doing and leverage them? Because time is always an issue in education. We always don't have enough time to do something. And that's often an excuse for ACT prep, is like, we don't have the time. So, okay, well, then we're going to find a way to make time in the skills that we're already covering. And this is one way that you can do that. Okay, and then production of writing, which I just want to make one more note. Well, actually, we can talk about it in this one as well. Production of writing is very closely tied to the writing rope in most of the strands of the writing rope. And it stands for, I tell kids to pretend like they're being editors when we talk about production of writing. If they're already decent writers, these questions are usually a little easier for them, but it's very important that we develop these expectations around their own writing to incorporate good use of it, which is what I kind of wanted to refer back to with CSE questions. So not only do I suggest mentor sentences for that, but using their own writing for that feedback, like we talked about, is going to also serve the purpose of production and writing questions, not just the CSE questions, just like with a slightly different lens on it. So this could be, you can take 5 or 10 minutes at the beginning of class as bell work with your kids to look at one sentence or one little paragraph that either you pulled from student writing or that they selected to look at, or from text in class, where they can analyze 1 or 2 components from CSE or 1 or 2 components from production and writing. So that, again, you're not overwhelming them, but they're getting that regular practice with it as well. You're going to want to make sure that kids know how to use transition words and phrases appropriately. This will be on the test pretty frequently. I have a resource linked in the next slide that I'm going to show you guys for kind of just like a starting point of what are transition words, when do we use them, what is their purpose, kind of thing. Coherent paragraph and essay structure, which again, I know that we're working on in their writing, that we're giving them feedback on. We have to give them that opportunity to fix it, to actually remediate the mistake. Good organization of ideas, which kind of goes along with that structure and coherent paragraphs. Strong thesis statements are important. If you click on that link that's on the PDF of this presentation, you'll go to a resource about how to help kids create claims. And then having concise ideas is also very important for this test and for their own writing. I pulled this worksheet from the City College of New York their writing center put this out, and it is all about transitional words and phrases. It kind of categorizes them of like when to use certain phrases, and then it gives some examples of how you use them between paragraphs, as well as when you're connecting sentences and within one single sentence, which are all important skills kids need to know. So this is something you could give kids as a resource. You could kind of break it down yourself, make it into an anchor chart, or if you were unsure of what exactly certain ones are, here's a resource for you to look at as well. And it's linked at the bottom of the slide too, if you want to click and get the actual PDF. This I pulled from the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. This one is their text structure, kind of like anchor chart. This is again something you could pull. I would maybe not give the kids all of this at one time, but like if you're focusing on one specific text structure in class, you have maybe just that one row to pull. But to help students identify text structure, you could use an annotation protocol in class, but you could also provide graphic organizers that are similar to what they have in this chart on the third column from the left when they're reading a text, especially if it's something that the curriculum's already calling for them to analyze this text structure and how that impacts meaning. It would be a really good opportunity for you to incorporate that. And it's linked at the bottom of this slide as well. You can tie in how transitions work in various types of text structures, that's why I like this chart, because it includes some of the transition words that may exist in each type of text structure, so that you can kind of like intertwine them and talk about how they're related, and that could go a long way with the students. Let's look at some examples. There we go. I had to get on the right slide. A couple of examples of production or writing questions. Again, these should be familiar, but I want to remind you what they look like. These are the ones that have actual questions attached to them, unlike CSE. Having to determine if information is relevant and whether or not it should be added is something that they're going to have to do on the ACT that you can talk about in class. Those kids love to put information in that isn't necessary, especially if they're trying to hit a word count or a page count. So talking about why something is or isn't needed in a sentence or a paragraph can go a pretty long way in terms of looking at students writing and in your own feedback as well. And then 37 and 38, questions 37 and 38 are good examples of the importance of teaching about author's purpose and only including relevant information in writing. And then you've got a question about paragraph structure for question 45. Where we want to think about how we always want students to refer back to their thesis in their conclusion. So just talking about how that structure should look in their own writing as well. And also identifying it in the reading that they're doing in class is important. And then lastly, questions 7 through 9, those are all production and writing questions talking about how to effectively and concisely write and/or edit. Number 8 is an example of using transitions correctly, but it's all about being able to make sure that the kids are being concise with the messaging that they're trying to get across in their writing, or in the case of ACT, when they're editing someone else's writing. So in conjunction with our HQIM, students, they should already be writing regularly in their ELA classes. So this means students have many, many opportunities to work with these skills and for their teacher to give them some targeted feedback. Rubrics from Tier 1 curriculum might not have one of the explicit skills that you wanted to teach them on the rubric itself, but that doesn't mean you cannot still assess them and give them feedback on it. So explicitly and directly teaching what good examples of the production of writing components looks like in exemplar writing or mentor sentences, using very targeted feedback on just 1 or 2 skills per writing, and then consider allowing them the time or the chance to correct just that one little part of their writing for a regrade or to submit again. And it doesn't have to be super extensive. This can be in a single little paragraph writing or ticket out the door. It doesn't have to be in one of their big formal essays. In fact, it might even be better to hit them with these pieces of feedback on smaller writing, so that way when they get to the bigger writing, they're less likely to make those mistakes. Incorporating some production of writing skills in whatever your peer editing protocols are can also be really beneficial. And then using your informational text that you're going to be reading to discuss structure, organization, flow of ideas, transitions, and how all of those work together to help the reader better understand the text is also really important to being able to see how they can use it in their own writing. Most units, like what you see on here from guidebooks, has peer review designated in somewhere during the instruction. So once you've given that explicit instruction on a specific skill, let's say maybe you focused on how to properly use semicolons that week, and that's like really the only skill you really honed in on, then maybe requiring kids to use a semicolon 1 time or 2 times in their writing effectively is going to be something you're looking for in their writing. You can incorporate that into their peer editing as well. If they look for it, they talk with their peers about, hey, did I do this right? Do I need to edit it? Is this the correct way to use a semicolon, or, whatever the skill is that you chose to use. Then when you're actually looking at your text, calling attention to details, to author's purpose and structure in informational text, and having students use this as models for good writing is going to really further reinforce those skills, because not only are you having them do it in their own writing, you're having them look at examples of it in already established writing as well. And the more chances they get to work with, to see, to talk about that skill, the more likely it is to stick. And then I do want to highlight this one particular activity from guidebooks. This question is, how does the sequence of information in Complications from the Warmth of Other Suns enhance your understanding of the complexity of the impacts of migration on your migrants specifically and the broader migrant population? This question is asking them about sequence. So it is asking them about text structure. So this is a fantastic opportunity for you guys to talk about text structure before they go to write this claim. And they're going to have a class discussion around this too, but just the idea that they can talk about text structure right here without ever having to write in that specific text structure. They're talking about sequence here. They can use that, or you can use that to leverage kind of a segue into, don't forget, also on the ACT, you're going to be asked, for these types of things. And then let's look at our very last category, knowledge of language. KLA, this is the shortest or the smallest group of questions on the test, only 10 to 12 questions on the whole test. But KLA questions, you need to reinforce conciseness of writing with your students. Conciseness is king for ACT. They may have 4 answer choices that all are technically grammatically correct, but students should always pick the most concise answer. So you want to work with them to avoid like excessively long sentences or sentences with a lot of filler through their own writing. Discuss how word choice impacts the meaning of a sentence through mentor sentences. Again, you can use these mentor sentences for honestly every single one of the skills on the ACT if you find the right sentence or if you develop the right sentence. So please do not discount mentor sentences. They're so powerful in students seeing examples of good writing and then being able to mimic those as well. And then there's a resource linked on this slide that you can click on the PDF that is from UNC Chapel Hill that kind of goes through all the different ways that students kind of fall into traps of not being concise and how to fix it. Again, a great resource for you to look at as a starting point or to provide for students who you think could handle that type of resource. On the test, it's typically focusing on word choice and conciseness like we talked about. So question 5, 40, and 41 are all KLA, and they're specifically asking for word choice and conciseness. Talking about connotation also can be important for these questions as well, because they need to be able to pick the word that best fits in the context of the passage, even if there's more than one word that might work for the question. So like I said, mentor sentences, I know I'm harping on them, but they're so powerful. They're great for discussing word choice and the impact of using those words on the meaning of the sentence, on the connotation of the sentence as well. You could even have students attempt to rewrite these sentences more concisely without retracting from the meaning, so that they are getting some practice with what does concise writing look like? How do I practice concise writing? Just to have them have a jumping point so they don't have to come up with something completely blind. So a couple of considerations. A lot of our high school students come to us with very little foundational knowledge of parts of speech, sentence types, strong writing skills, etc. They were supposed to have been taught it. They probably were. It doesn't mean they retained it. So we have to meet them where they are first. This is where that direct and explicit instruction is so important. Also, using student-friendly language when you need to. If you start throwing out words like gerund and preposition and sometimes even transitional phrase or things like that, and they don't know what that is, you've lost them. So meet them where they are with your language as well. Even the term independent and dependent clause I found can be overwhelming for some kids. So start off with, is this a sentence? It's an independent clause. Not a sentence, then it's not an independent clause, it's a dependent clause. Start there. It's very elementary, it's very basic, and I know it feels a little childish, but I found that when I start here with kids and then graduate them up to more sophisticated language, just in terms of my own instruction, it's gone a long way. For especially those kids that are already kind of behind with these skills. After you have met them where they are and you've done some initial instruction, then you can appropriately increase your expectations. And then those skills have got to be regularly reinforced in as many ways as possible in your classroom, not just taught one time as a mini lesson and then move on. You have to keep referring back to them and have them practice and engage with those skills as often as possible, just like you would with vocabulary instruction. Um, and lastly, I just want to thank you all. It's imperative that you remind your students when learning these skills that while they do tie directly to the lesson that you're teaching and they're part of being a good writer, they're also an ACT skill. If you're constantly reminding them that the ACT is a key to money that they may need in their post-high school endeavors while also teaching them to be good communicators, you're going to garner a lot more buy-in from your students, which is, as many of you know, with high school students, half the battle. But I hope that this has been helpful to you. I hope that you've been able to get some information that you can use in your own classroom. If you need any more support or have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to us at louisianaliteracy@la.gov. And I hope you guys have a great day.